Hi, I'm Kim Williams from Kansas State University, and this eGrow University presentation provides more in-depth consideration to watering plugs and bedding plants in follow-up to the lecture of Overview of Greenhouse Irrigation Systems. Watering plugs is all about managing moisture, and it's a lot harder than it sounds. Growers must adjust the amount of water that they apply as the seedlings develop from germination during stage 1 through stage 4 when plugs are being held prior to transplant. It's also necessary to appreciate species-specific moisture preferences at different stages of growth. Keeping cells uniformly moist is tricky, but it's extremely important. If plants in some cells stay especially wet or dry, then their growth is going to be negatively affected, and a tray or flat will exhibit a range of plant growth size. You can see the effect of water and nutrients dripping from the hanging baskets overhead onto these impatiens plugs below. Just a little extra water and fertilizer definitely influences plant growth. At stage 1, when the seed germinates, it begins with imbibing water, and most crops require the maintenance of high moisture levels. Once the radicle or seed root emerges and penetrates the substrate, the moisture level should be reduced for most crops. This means that the root medium should become slightly lighter in color between water application. This slight dry down will encourage roots to grow more deeply into the substrate, and it'll minimize stem stretch for some crops. By stage 2, germination is finished and cotyledons, or the seed leaves, are expanding. During stage 3, roots and leaves are actively growing, so moisture levels are adjusted as the stages progress to gradually having greater swings between moist and dry conditions as the seedlings get larger and larger. To tone a plug crop, or to hold it for transplanting, which is stage 4, seedlings are allowed to dry out even further before watering. Plants may even be allowed to wilt. Of course, there are exceptions. For example, begonia seedlings in stage 2 and early stage 3 have very shallow, fibrous root systems, so substrate moisture must be managed carefully. If surface drying occurs, seedlings will stall and the crop will not be uniform. But if the substrate is maintained as too moist, algae will grow on its surface. Alternatively, a crop like Lisianthus will quickly develop roots deep into the plug cell. Therefore, more surface dry down can occur earlier in seedling development, which will help minimize algae growth. Evaluating root medium moisture status involves judging color changes of the substrate and picking up a tray here and there to evaluate its weight. Many producers have developed in-house rating scales to describe substrate color and then train growers to apply water according to the scale. For example, on a 1 to 5 scale, a 1 would indicate a bone-dry cell that has a light tan color of the substrate, and a 5 would indicate a saturated cell that had dark black substrate color. Growers would be instructed that a begonia needs to stay at, say, a 4 through early stage 3 of plant development, but Lisianthus should dry down to a 3 between waterings as early as stage 2 of seedling development. One of the most common systems for delivering water to plugs are either the low-tech but very flexible hand watering or the use of boom irrigation. Overhead sprinklers are also sometimes used. Watering by hand requires careful training and a broad selection of watering tools, from mist nozzles for crops with very fine seeds to water wands with breakers that will deliver a higher volume of water with larger water droplets. For example, watering those begonia plugs that we've been talking about requires a fine mist, because if one of the cotyledons lodges under the substrate root medium or the substrate surface, then the seedling is inclined to die. These adjustments often include managing the edge effect, which is the phenomenon where the substrate in the tray or flat edges dries out faster in those cells that are right on the edge of the tray compared to those cells that are in the middle of the tray. This occurs as air moves by the edges, increasing plant transpiration and thus dry down. It's common to have to water just the edges of the trays and flats differently than the other cells, and that adds to the watering challenge. Watering technique must focus on proper coverage of all trays, especially the edges. It's common to just paint the edges of plug trays, which dry down faster than other cells in the tray, especially if they're positioned to allow for air movement between them. So for example, a tray edge may be just 2 or 3 cell widths in size, and the grower then has the goal of just applying water to those 2 or 3 cell widths. And this of course requires a really precise technique. Tricks include using a water breaker such that the diameter of the water spray exactly matches one tray width, and avoiding a back and forth waving motion with the wand. Instead, use an up and down crane motion with the watering wand, which will help avoid having kind of a wavy effect of the plugs as they developed. The bottom line is that the plug grower must know how much water to deliver to different crops at different stages of growth, which means making adjustments almost daily based on changes in weather and plant growth. Bottom heat can help trays dry out more uniformly, but accounting for the edge effect is a necessary adjustment that must be made with irrigation of plug and bedding plant crops. Thanks to the Glockner Foundation and the partnering universities for supporting the eGrow University project.